Okay, great. So that brings us to the end of the first major part of the class on equality of opportunity. Now we're going to transition to the second part of the class on education, which is of course going to be closely related and build on what we talked about in the first part, because as you all know, education is widely viewed as one of the most scalable pathways to upward mobility in the United States and elsewhere. We talked about it as an important correlated factor in the previous lecture, but as we'll talk about in these coming lectures, there's a strong view also that education, it's not just important in terms of predictive power and differences in mobility, but it's really one of the key things that we can potentially change. To the extent we think things like social capital, family structure, segregation, all these other factors might matter for long-term outcomes, they may well be as important or maybe even more important than education, but education has the virtue that we've for a long time thought about how we might improve education, change educational policies, and so forth. It's more in the policy space. Now, that said, there's growing concern that education no longer provides a strong pathway to opportunity in the United States in particular. And there are many pieces of evidence. You've probably read about a lot of this stuff in the media that people talk about. So people worry about the fact that kids in the US nowadays typically perform worse on standardized tests on average than in many European countries, despite the fact that we actually spend more on our schools per capita than many European countries do. So that's just a statement about the levels. Average performance doesn't seem that great in US schools if you look at standardized tests and compared to other places. There's also concerns about variation within the United States. So there are very sharp differences in the quality of schools across school districts, across different cities, and we worry in particular because of the local property tax finance system that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds may not have access to the same quality of K through 12 education. So those first 2 points are about the K through 12 elementary education space. Analogously, there are worries about the higher education space as well, as many of you will be well aware of. So rising costs of college, people worry about a lack of access for low-income students as a result of that. And then people also worry that while we have increasing access to certain types of colleges, in particular, there's a tremendous growth of for-profit institutions in recent years, maybe those colleges are actually not producing very good outcomes and are not actually that helpful for the students who are attending them. So lots of I think potential in the education space, but also lots of concern, and increasingly so, that we may not be really delivering on the idea that education is the great leveler that creates opportunity for everyone. So, big picture question we're going to talk about in the next few lectures: how can we try to improve the education system in America? Traditionally, people have been thinking about these issues for a long time. Traditionally, measuring the impacts of education systematically was pretty difficult because you didn't have really good data on outcomes to see what different types of educational institutions are really doing. Now, as we've talked about in other contexts, administrative data, in this case from colleges and school districts, are really giving us a much more scientific understanding in the recent years of what economists would call the education production function. How do we produce education and produce good outcomes using education as effectively as possible? So what we're going to do these next lectures is kind of work our way backwards through the education system, starting with the higher ed system, and then go to the K through 12 system. And so in this lecture, in particular, I'm going to focus on a paper with my colleagues called Mobility Report Cards: The Role of Colleges in Intergenerational Mobility. So that's on your syllabus and can be a useful reference for what we're going to cover here. Okay, so the question we're asking in this paper, the first question we'll tackle in this topic, is just a very big picture question: how do colleges shape income mobility in the US, or how does the higher education system affect the level of intergenerational income mobility in the US? So the answer to that question is not totally obvious, and the reason is that in principle, higher education can provide a pathway to upward mobility that is attractive in the sense that it's not directly shaped by the neighborhood where a child happens to grow up, right? So the great promise of higher ed in some sense is you may have happened to have been born in a family in a neighborhood without a lot of resources. Once you get to college, maybe that really changes things, opens doors, and allows you to break free from whatever circumstances you happen to be born into. So that is, in principle, a possibility. However, if in practice children from higher income families tend to attend better colleges, then the higher education system may not actually promote mobility, right? If the kids who get to go to the best colleges are all the ones who come from the best neighborhoods and the highest income families, it doesn't actually really change things that much. In fact, you can show that colleges could actually increase the intergenerational persistence of income, that is, reduce mobility across generations, if the disparities in college attendance rates and the types of colleges kids from low and high income families attend are sufficiently large. Basically, you amplify the advantages potentially that high income kids had to begin with if there's a lot of stratification in the higher education system. So it's really an empirical question for which you need a lot of data to figure out how colleges are shaping intergenerational mobility and how potentially we could change admissions policies or other types of policies to amplify the impacts of the higher ed system on mobility. So in order to make progress, it's useful to have the following conceptual framework in mind. The effect of the higher education system on mobility across generations fundamentally depends upon three factors. You can write this out mathematically, or you can just see the logic of it. It's quite straightforward. So the way to think about mobility is there are a set of inputs. So who is showing up at every college in America? So take Harvard students, for example. If we think about mobility at Harvard, one of the things that matters is what is the income distribution of the people who are coming in? So what does the parent income distribution of students at Harvard look like, for example? If there are very few low-income students at a given college, then that college cannot be, in some accounting sense, contributing a great deal to mobility, because if we think of mobility as rising from the bottom of the income distribution to the top, if there are no low-income kids in certain colleges, obviously they can't be having a big impact on mobility. So that's the starting point, the inputs into each college, the parental income distributions. Okay, so then to think about mobility, it's not just about who comes in the door, it's also about how they end up doing after they go out the door. And so the second thing you want to look at are students' earnings outcomes, conditional on parent income by college. So is it the case that at Harvard or at any given college, lots of kids come from low or middle income families and end up rising up? How do kids from low income families at Harvard end up doing 5-10 years after graduation? So that's the second thing that matters. The third thing that matters, again, comes back to the key issue of correlation versus causality. We need to understand the portion of the variation in the students' earnings outcomes that we see across colleges that is due to colleges' causal effects. So we're going to see, will not surprise you, that outcomes of Harvard students look great in terms of earnings. Is that just because of who gets into Harvard? Or is that because of some causal treatment effect of attending Harvard? If it's all about selection, then changing which students attend which colleges may not actually have a very big impact on mobility if there's no actual treatment effect of attending a different institution. Okay? And so that third piece is also going to be critical in terms of understanding how this all plays out in the aggregate system. So what we're going to do is talk about the empirical evidence on each of these three elements in some detail. And then we're going to tie them all together to think about how higher education affects mobility, and in particular, what would happen if we had different types of admissions rules. So hypothetically, if we moved to an admissions rule where it was based, say, purely on SAT scores, or if there was class-based affirmative action, for example, giving an advantage for kids from lower income families, we'll be able to simulate out how that would affect segregation at colleges and how that will affect income mobility once we have these three inputs. But the first thing we're going to do is concentrate on measuring these three things as well as we can with modern data. Okay, so how do we do that? So in the paper that I'm discussing here, we estimate these three sets of parameters for every college in America using data covering all college students in the US from 1990 to 2013. So that's about 30 million students, okay? And so how do we get that data? We combine information from 3 sources to construct an anonymized data set. So the first is you need data on income. You'll be familiar with where we get that. It's the same source as what we've been talking about in the previous lecture. So we're going to get parental income and student income from income tax records. Then we need to know where everybody in America is going to college. So how do you figure that out? Turns out that the IRS receives records from every college in the US, like Harvard, for instance, will report the Social Security numbers of all students who attend Harvard to the IRS in order to have a double reporting system when parents claim tax credits or deductions when they send their kids to college. Okay, so the IRS wants to make sure that parents are not making up the fact that they're sending their kid to a college, and so they have a double reporting system where the colleges also report which kids are attending the colleges, and so you end up having this information. We also supplement that with data from the Department of Education on who got a Pell Grant, because there are some coverage issues at the bottom of the income distribution if you just use what's called the IRS 1098-T tax data. So you can put those things together. All of this, as you can imagine, is a fair bit of back-end work with various government agencies. But you can put those things together and basically get a complete roster of students at every college in America. And then the third piece of information we're going to use is we have data on everyone's SAT scores from the College Board, which is going to be very useful in figuring out the causal effects of colleges, as you'll see when we get to the third part. Now, one important note before I get into the analysis, you'll see why this ends up being quite important. All of the statistics we're going to show you for colleges are based on whether you attend a college or not necessarily whether you complete, that is, whether you graduate. So at Harvard, that distinction is not that important. Almost all kids who attend Harvard end up graduating. But at most colleges in the United States, especially 2-year colleges, completion is a huge deal, right? Many kids don't end up completing at lower ranked schools, and that ends up driving some of the effects that we'll see. Okay, so any questions on the basic setup of the data before we start talking about results? Or questions on what we're trying to do here? Yeah. No. In fact, you cannot pay the government to get access to these data. There's a complicated, back-end set of bureaucratic arrangements, as you can imagine, to get this sort of data and work with it. But you work with it in collaboration with people at the government and internally at government agencies. But it's not, you can't, buy everyone's tax records by paying the government, as you can imagine. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, so let's start with the first piece, parent income distributions by college. All right, so what are we actually measuring here? We're going to define parent income as average pre-tax household income during the 5-year period when the kid is between ages 15 and 19. So you can measure incomes at various points of a child's life. It doesn't actually end up mattering that much. What we decided to do here is measure income around the time that kids are applying to and attending college. That seemed sensible when you're looking at college attendance issues. Like what we did in the earlier studies we talked about, we're going to focus on percentile ranks. So we're exactly like we did before. We're going to rank parents relative to other parents with children in the same birth cohort, right? So if take all the kids who were born, say, in 1980, there are about 3.5 million of them, rank their parents from 1 to 3.5 million based on their incomes. Convert that to percentiles. Okay, give you a sense of dollar magnitudes. We're going to talk about people in the bottom fifth, the top 1%. Just want to give you a feel for what those numbers are in terms of dollars. So this is just plotting the empirical distribution of income in our data. And so you can see the 20th percentile is $25,000 a year. The 80th percentile is $111,000 a year, so that puts you in the top fifth, being above 111K. To be in the top 1%, you have to be making more than about $500,000 a year on average over this 5-year period that we're looking at. There's been, as I showed you in earlier lectures, a significant increase in inequality over time. So this is for kids born in the 1980 birth cohort. If we look at kids born, say, in the 1995 birth cohort, or say, your year, that 99th percentile cutoff would be more like 650,000. So it's gone up by about 150K. We use the percentile cutoff that's relevant for your birth cohort to account for these changes over time, okay? So the first thing to say before we start to get into the data about specific colleges, the first simple point is that just whether you go to college or not is strongly related to your parents' income. So this is just plotting college attendance rates versus parent income percentile. Near the top of the distribution, virtually all kids of the highest income parents go to college, like a 95% rate. But then if you get to kids born to families at the bottom of the income distribution, it's something like 30% go to college. And this is going to college by the time you're in your early 20s. So some people will go to college, later on in their life and so forth. It's not a terribly huge number, but the point is, at least the traditional way you'd think about traditional college attendance ages, there is a dramatic gradient here, something like a 65 percentage point gap between kids from the lowest income families and the highest income families. So that's just whether you go to college or not. What I think is actually more important and actually drives some of the issues I'm going to talk about in an even stronger way is that the types of colleges low and high income kids go to tend to be quite different. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. To get into that, I first want to just do a poll to get a sense of people's perceptions of these issues before showing you the data for specific colleges. And so given that we're here at Harvard, let me ask you the following question. How much more likely do you think you are to attend Harvard if your parents are in the top 1%, so earning more than $500,000, $600,000 a year, versus the bottom 20%? So there are your choices. Twice as likely, 5 times, goes on. Give you a minute to fill that out.
Option H.
What did you say? Yeah.
Is there an option H, like 100 plus times more likely?
100 plus times? There is no, it's one of these, I can tell you that. All right, it's like we've got a distribution there that's centered around 60 or 80 times, which is, that's a pretty high ratio. So let's look at what the data actually have to say here. All right, so this is the parent income distribution of students at Harvard, first just by quintiles. I'm going to get to the top 1% in a second. So this is just very simple tab. Take all the students who are classes of 2002 to 2004 at Harvard. So this is obviously a little bit earlier, actually around the time that I was a student here in the college. But as I'll get to in a second, this has not changed tremendously over time. So 3% of students come from the bottom fifth, 5.3% from the second quintile, 70% from the top quintile. So obviously, if you were drawing uniformly from the US income distribution, random sampling, you'd have 20% in each of these. So, perhaps not surprisingly, you have significantly more high-income kids than low-income kids. 15.4% of kids are from the top 1%, okay? And so what that means, answer to your question, is that your probability of attending Harvard is 103 times higher if you're from the top 1% than the bottom 20%, right? So how does that work out? The top 1% is a group that's 20 times smaller than the bottom 20%, but the number of kids who are at Harvard from the top 1% is 5 times more than the number of kids from the bottom 20%. So 5 times 20 gets you to about 100, right? So Harvard is enormously skewed in terms of representation towards kids from very, very high-income families. And that's typical, actually. So I'm showing you the data for Harvard just because it's of interest given where we are. But if we now look more generally at Harvard and its peer institutions, so look at other elite private colleges, this is showing you the same kind of data that I showed you on the previous slide, but just horizontally. So bottom quintile is that dark red bar on the left, top 1% on the far right, and it's the shares of each of those groups. You can see it's basically the same at Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, et cetera. Now, one thing that's somewhat interesting is if you look at MIT and Caltech, in particular, MIT and Caltech have significantly lower top 1% shares, as you can see, than Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and so forth. Those are also the 2 colleges that don't really have legacy admissions. So, that I think is part of, different feel in terms of what the admissions rules look like at these institutions. But broadly, the big picture pattern is the representation of low-income kids at all of these institutions is pretty modest, okay? So to show you that now in a little bit more detail, let's pool together a set of colleges that we're going to call the Ivy Plus, a little bit arbitrary, but basically take the Ivy League plus Stanford, MIT, Duke, and Chicago, and now show the income distribution, the percent of students coming from each percentile of the parental income distribution rather than the 5 quintiles as we were doing before. So just, more granularity. And what I think is interesting about this is I had expected before we started looking at these data that you'd see a pretty steady increase once you were at the 75th, 80th, 85th percentile, but that's really not the case. It really only shoots up when you're at the very, very upper tail of the income distribution. If you're relatively affluent, you have slightly higher odds of being at elite private colleges in America, but it's not dramatically different from the middle class. It's really only when you're in the, $500,000 type range that you see dramatic changes in kids' chances of attending these colleges. Okay, so we've been focused on the elite private colleges. Let's now expand that to look at other colleges and broaden the discussion. So this is the data I showed you before for Harvard. Here's UC Berkeley, where I was previously a professor, and you might have thought intuitively UC Berkeley, like state flagship school, one of the most famous state schools in the United States. Intuitively, you think of a place like Berkeley as having maybe a much more access for low and middle income kids, and you can see that that's somewhat true. Berkeley does have fewer kids from high income families than Harvard does. But it does not have a tremendously large number of kids, actually, from low and middle income families. And that's true more broadly of many elite state flagship schools. Now, a school that looks fairly different is the State University of New York, Stony Brook, where there you see that the green bars, they all hover actually around the 20% mark. You're seeing an almost equal draw from the income distribution. So that looks pretty different. And then here's a fourth one, Glendale Community College, a really big community college in Los Angeles, where you see the opposite pattern, a greater share of students coming from low-income families than from higher-income families, so an opposite sign gradient. In many community colleges, you'll see a larger share of low-income students than higher-income students. Okay, so what you see, I'm giving you 4 examples here. We have this data for 2,500 different colleges in the US. It's all publicly available. You can look at it online. And there are a bunch of tools now to explore this type of data in an intuitive way. But the big picture, I think, point of this is that there are really sharp differences in parental income distributions across colleges. To put it differently, there's significant segregation across colleges in America by income. Just like we talked about earlier, there's significant segregation across neighborhoods in America. Okay, so coming back to what I was saying at the beginning, to motivate this discussion, if you think about higher education as providing ladders to upward mobility, and that's particularly likely to be the case if access to higher education institutions is similar for kids from different backgrounds, at least at first glance, this data suggests that you're not in that world where you have kids from very different backgrounds attending the same schools. And so to try to quantify that a bit more precisely, it's useful to compare the degree of segregation across colleges to the degree of segregation across neighborhoods. So when I show you that data, you can clearly reject the view that there's no segregation across colleges. Clearly, it's not a uniform income distribution across all colleges. But just how much segregation is there? Is it large? Is it small? Should we be worried about it? It's not totally clear, right? And so there's been extensive discussion we all experience in kind of our day-to-day lives how segregated American cities are. So you know that there are affluent neighborhoods, there are less affluent neighborhoods. If you're in an affluent neighborhood, you don't come into contact in many American cities with lower and middle income people that much. There's a common perception, I think, maybe many of you had this view when you were coming to college, that college is a place where you're likely to meet people from much more diverse backgrounds than where you grew up, right? In particular, much more diverse backgrounds, what we're focused on here socioeconomically. There's this idea that there's going to be greater interaction between kids from different socioeconomic backgrounds than in the neighborhoods where they grew up. So is that actually the case? So we can assess that in the following very simple way with these data. Let's think about the following simple summary measure of the amount of segregation. So what we're doing here is asking if you're a kid whose parents are in the bottom quintile, okay, so you yourself come from the bottom quintile, what fraction of your peers in the college that you attend come from the bottom quintile, the second quintile, the third quintile, the fifth quintile, okay? So again, if kids were uniformly mixed across all colleges, this would be 20% in all the bars, right? So what is happening here is, as you can see, you have in your college much fewer peers if you're from a low-income family. You have many fewer peers who are from high-income families than who are themselves from low-income families, all right? And so what's the simple logic for that? If you're a kid from a low-income family, as we saw earlier, you're much more likely to, say, attend a community college or some sort of lower-ranked institution. Many other low-income kids attend those institutions as well. Many fewer high-income kids do. And so as a result, you are less exposed to high-income kids in your college if you're from a low-income family than you are to other low-income kids. So that's the data for colleges. Now you can do the exact same exercise for the neighborhood in which you grew up, okay? And that gives you these bars here, basically asking who are you exposed to in your pre-college neighborhood. If you're a low-income kid, what fraction of your childhood neighbors are low-income, middle-income, high-income? And the big picture point I want to make here, without dwelling too much on those small differences, is that those two things look basically the same. So if you look at the fifth quintile, for instance, in both your college and your pre-college residential neighborhood, about 10% of the people you're around are going to be from the top quintile on average. And so it doesn't look like the degree of integration across colleges is actually tremendously different than the degree of integration across neighborhoods. A different cut at the data that makes basically the same point, look at now the income distribution of the peers of kids from the top quintile. So this is looking at the flip side. Suppose you are from a relatively high-income family. What fraction of your peers in your college and your childhood neighborhood come from different parts of the income distribution? So if you're from a high-income family, you tend to be around people from high-income families in both your childhood neighborhood and your college. And again, those rates look roughly the same. The degree of segregation of high-income people looks about the same across neighborhoods as it does across colleges. I think most striking is if you zoom in particular on places like Harvard, if we go to the Ivy Plus group that we were looking at before, you see, I think, an interesting fact, which is if we focus now on kids from high-income families, that's the majority of kids as we saw at Ivy Plus colleges. Kids from high-income families, what fraction of their peers in their college and what fraction of their peers in their childhood neighborhood are themselves from high-income families? You can see that you actually have fewer peers from low and middle income backgrounds in college than you did in your own childhood neighborhoods. So you are less likely to come into contact with kids from low and middle income parents here at Harvard than you were in your childhood neighborhood. That's what you see directly in these data. So it's the opposite of reducing segregation. There's actually amplified segregation at elite private colleges relative to the childhood neighborhoods where those kids grew up. Okay? Yeah. No, it's true even without the top 1%. So if you look at the top 1% in particular, we have those calculations in the paper. You see, a more exaggerated version of this, of course, in the top 1%. But even among kids from the top 1% here, you are more likely to be exposed to kids from the top 1% here at Harvard than you were in your childhood neighborhood. So it continues throughout the income distribution. It's not a fact just driven by the top 1%. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Perfect question. Trends in income segregation. That's the next thing that I'm going to talk about. Exactly as you said, the preceding estimates are based on kids born between 1980 and 82, attended college in the early 2000s. As you noted, there have been substantial changes in the higher education system since that time, and in particular, substantial changes in financial aid at places like this, and tuition policies more broadly. So some favorable, like the increase in financial aid places like Harvard, but then at many state schools, significant increases in tuition, reductions in financial aid. So things have gone in different directions in different places, right? So very natural question, how has income segregation across colleges changed in recent years? What can we learn from that? Are these data still relevant today? Can we get some lessons about what might matter going forward? Okay, so let me show you a few different things on this. I'll come to the Harvard specific data in a second. So let's first start at the broader level. So think about those measures of segregation that I was showing you. What fraction of peers come from the top income quintile for kids who are themselves from the top income quintile? So this is that rightmost bar on the chart that I was just showing you. And so the blue series is measures the amount of segregation, basically, in pre-college residential neighborhoods. And then the red series is for segregation across colleges. And the point I want to make here is both of these things look basically flat, right? They're up to the point where we have data, about 2011 or so. There's no real appreciable change in the amount of isolation of kids from high-income families from other backgrounds, either at the neighborhood level or the college level. So in the aggregate, you're not really seeing much of a change. Let's now break that data down and look at specific colleges. So this is now coming to answer your question. So in particular, around 2006, 2007, there were a series of changes at elite private colleges. Many of you might have heard about this. Harvard effectively became free for kids from low and middle income families. Stanford followed suit the next year and so forth. And what you can see is now we can plot various different statistics here. But if you look at, in this case, the fraction of kids from the bottom fifth, you look at the red line for Harvard, you see a little bit of an uptick around 2006, 2007, but it's not really a very large change. If you look at Stanford, it looks totally flat. I'm showing you the data here for kids from the bottom 20%. You can also look at other statistics like fraction of kids from the bottom 60%, which might be more relevant because some of the changes were targeted specifically at the middle class. There also, you can debate, was there a small increase, was there not? What is very clear from the data is there definitely was not a dramatic change, okay? Where you see significantly larger changes in the American higher education system are, you look at places like UC Berkeley or Stony Brook, right, which I showed you, had a fairly equal income distribution at the beginning of the period. Stony Brook has a steady decline in the fraction of kids from low-income families. You see a little bit of that at Berkeley, see quite a bit of that at Glendale Community College. So what's happening in some of these state institutions is as government support, basically, funding for state institutions is being shrunk, many state universities like Stony Brook increasingly have pressure to increase tuition and admit more out-of-state students who tend to be higher income, and so they're serving a smaller and smaller share of low-income students. Now, there are many other trends in the higher ed system as well. There are more kids now attending, low-income kids attending for-profit institutions. There are more low-income kids attending two-year community colleges, at least certain two-year community colleges. So all of it on net basically leaves the amount of segregation roughly unchanged in the system as a whole. There are significant changes at specific colleges, as you can see. But coming back to your question, at the elite private colleges, our sense is the changes in financial aid actually did not have an enormous impact by themselves. Now, that said, so the way I interpret that is if you want to increase the representation of low-income students, you might need to do more in addition to changing financial aid, right? Like, it's hard to imagine financial aid is totally irrelevant. Obviously, if the college was completely unaffordable, it's hard to imagine you'd have a lot of low-income students. But I think of it as like, it's not sufficient by itself. And so we'll talk a little bit later in subsequent lectures about what else might make a difference. But that's what the data have to say about the financial aid change by itself. Okay, so let me stop here to take some questions. Anybody else? Yeah, in the back there, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so you might worry about that. So we've also, it was easier for technical data reasons to do zip code than census tract, which would have maybe been the more natural measure because it's a little bit finer. We know from other work that census tract would give you something extremely similar, so I'm not worried about that for that reason, but you're right. If you only have the data on zip code, you might worry about that, yeah. Anybody else? Okay, great. So what we're gonna do now is turn to the second part of the picture on students' earnings outcomes. Okay, so what we'll do is measure kids' individual earnings in their mid-30s. So one thing I should note just as a point of distinction, so in everything we've been doing so far on the parent side, we've been using household income. So both earners, if they're two earners in a family. We do it that way because we think total resources might matter for kids' outcomes. When we look at the kids in contrast, we are going to look at individual earnings, excluding your spouse. Now, we also construct studies including your spouse. The reason we did it this way is because it turns out that rates of marriage also vary pretty sharply across colleges, and they also vary significantly across, with parental income. And so you will start to see patterns that are driven, in significant part by differences in marriage rates rather than differences in a child's own earnings if you use household income measures in the early 30s or in the mid 30s, okay? So just to be clear on what we're doing. Okay, and so again with the kids, we're gonna define percentile ranks by ranking kids relative to other kids born in the same year. Let me once again just give you a sense of the distribution, give you a sense of magnitudes. So when we're looking at the income distribution as a whole for individual income for kids at age 34, getting into the top fifth means earning more than about $60,000 a year. Getting into the top 1% means earning about more than $200,000 a year when you're 34 years old. And the median is $28,000 a year, okay? So that's, keep those numbers in mind as we talk about the different quintiles. Okay, so to look at students' earnings outcomes, I'm gonna go back to the charts that I was showing you of parent income distributions, which are the bars here. And I'm gonna add these lines, and I'm giving you an example here with Columbia and Stony Brook. And the lines show you the fraction of kids who reach the top fifth of the income distribution. sorry, that should be labeled, but just to be clear, each dot there is telling you the fraction of children in a given parent income quintile who end up reaching the top fifth, okay? So that upper left blue dot for Columbia, that tells you that about 60% of kids from low-income families at Columbia end up reaching the top fifth of the income distribution. At Stony Brook, that number is like 50%. So what is, I think, most interesting about this chart is not necessarily that level, but the fact that that line is almost perfectly flat across the income distribution. So basically what that's telling you is that kids from low-income families and kids from high-income families at Columbia have essentially the same outcomes. And the same thing is true at Stony Brook as well, and the same thing is true more generally at all of the colleges we've looked at. There's some gradient, but it's not very large, okay? And so why is that so important? The key lesson that you see there is what it implies is that most of the gap in the outcomes that we see between children from high and low income families in the United States, so kind of starting fact that kids from high income families tend to do much better than kids from low income families, most of that can be explained by differences between colleges, that is differences in the colleges they attend, rather than within colleges. That is to say, if you take kids from low and high income families attending the same college, they have much more similar outcomes. Maybe not identical outcomes, but much more similar outcomes. And so why is that important from the mobility perspective? It raises the possibility that reallocating students across colleges could potentially have a significant impact on intergenerational mobility, right? Imagine for a moment that we had found the converse. Suppose the gap in outcomes by parental income was large even among Harvard students or even among students at Columbia. Then if that were true, then simply changing the admissions rules and reallocating students across colleges, you'd be surprised if that would have any effect, right? If even at a given college, low-income kids end up having significantly different outcomes, you're not necessarily going to do anything by changing admissions rules. The fact that those lines look pretty flat raises the possibility that changes in the higher education system could potentially have a big impact on intergenerational income mobility. So we view that as encouraging in terms of suggesting there could be a pretty significant role for higher education, potential changes in higher education admissions policies for having an impact on mobility. Okay, is that clear? Any questions on that? Okay, so what we can then do is combine the data on parents' incomes and students' outcomes in order to characterize colleges' mobility rates. So specifically, think about the following question. At which colleges in America do the largest number of children come from poor families and end up, say, in the top fifth or end up in the upper middle class? Okay, so if you think about mobility as rising from the bottom to the top, at which colleges in America, just in a descriptive accounting sense, where are we seeing that happening the most? Where you've got lots of kids coming in from poor families and ending up doing quite well. So to make that precise quantitatively, I'm going to focus on two statistics in particular. What I call the top quintile outcome rate, that's just the fraction of students who reach the top quintile. That number is 51% at Stony Brook. And then I'm going to focus on what you might think of as low-income access, or the representation of low-income students at a given college, which is the fraction of parents from the bottom quintile. And at Stony Brook, that number is 16%, okay? So we can combine these two numbers to construct what we call a mobility rate. So we're going to define a college's mobility rate as the fraction of its students who come from the bottom quintile and end up in the top quintile. So for students who've taken a statistics class, this is a joint probability, right? What's the probability that you both come from the bottom quintile and end up in the top quintile? That mobility rate can be computed very simply as follows. It's just the product of the fraction of students who come from the bottom quintile, the product of low-income access, and the top quintile rate, the fraction of those students who end up reaching the top quintile. So let me just walk through an example that I think will make that clear. So remember at Stony Brook, we saw that 16% of students come from families in the bottom quintile, right? Of those students, 51% make it to the top quintile. So what does that mean? 8.4% of them started out in the bottom quintile and ended up in the top quintile, just the product of those two numbers. Another, you might notice, if you've taken a statistics class, this is basically Bayes' rule. That's what you're seeing here. And so that mobility rate, 8.4%, how do we interpret that number? It means that if I talk to 100 kids at Stony Brook and talk about their experience, 8.4 of them, on average, will have come from a relatively poor family and will have ended up, when we're measuring their earnings at age 30, near the top of the income distribution, the top fifth of the income distribution, okay? So the mobility rate gives you some sense of the role a college is playing in terms of, promoting income mobility. I want to be careful about saying promoting because we haven't shown anything about causal effects here, but at least in a descriptive sense, it's kind of where mobility is happening, if you'd like. Okay, so I talked about the mobility rate at Stony Brook, and we talked about the data for Columbia. So I'm going to use this visual device to show you the data for all colleges in the US and give you a sense of what mobility rates look like. So what we're doing here is plotting the top quintile outcome rate, what fraction of kids reach the top fifth, versus the low-income access measure, the percent of parents who are in the bottom quintile. So remember, at Stony Brook, for example, we had 16% of kids coming from the bottom quintile and about 50% of them reaching the top quintile. That's how you have that dot. Columbia had fewer kids from low-income families, slightly better outcomes in terms of higher levels of earnings, okay? So those are two colleges. Now we can introduce all the colleges in the US with all of these dots, okay? Each college is a dot on this plot. So first thing you see is there's a strong negative correlation between these two things. Kids from low-income families, so colleges that serve a lot of low-income kids, tend to have poorer outcomes. So what is a concrete way to say that? What are these colleges that are near the bottom here? Those are a lot of community colleges, or it might be for-profit colleges, less selective colleges basically, or non-selective colleges, which tend to have a high representation of kids from low-income families, as we saw in the first part of what we discussed. And they also tend not to have very high levels of earnings outcomes. Now, to be clear, that could be either because those colleges don't actually provide very good instruction, don't actually maybe connect you to good networks, they don't have a great treatment effect, or it could be about selection, right? Obviously, the types of kids who are going to those colleges, the backgrounds they have coming in are very different than the types of kids who are sitting in the room here today. So there's obviously an important selection component as well. So we're going to talk about that in the next section when we talk about causal effects. But for now, just as a fact in the data, you see that low-income kids tend to go to colleges where you have relatively poor earnings outcomes. And then if you look at the places with very limited access for low-income kids or small representation of low-income kids, places like Columbia or Harvard, you see much higher outcomes. So we can look at a few different clusters of colleges here. So you can look at the Ivy Plus institutions. They're all concentrated on the upper left of this chart. Relatively few low-income kids, some of the best earnings outcomes that you see. Another group that's interesting is the state public flagships. So as I was saying earlier, we had expected going into this that the state public flagships, places like Berkeley, would be some of the highest mobility rate places, where you'd have lots of kids from low-income families and quite good outcomes. They do have very good outcomes, as you can see, Berkeley, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and so forth. But in terms of access, they actually don't look that much dramatically higher in terms of their representation of low-income kids than the elite private colleges, okay? And so what then are the colleges that have the highest mobility rates? Those are the colleges that are in the upper right. They're like the upper right outliers on this chart, right? They both manage to have a lot of low-income kids, and they have pretty good outcomes for low-income kids. So what are those places? So this is a list of the top 10 colleges in America by bottom to top quintile mobility rates. Okay, and so you can see here that the places on this list are not necessarily the places you would think of as, you know, some traditional like US News and World Report type best colleges in America. They're more mid-tier public institutions. So you take like Cal State LA, we talked about Stony Brook, the City University of New York. In all of these places, you have something like a mobility rate of 8 or even, you know, nearly 10% at Cal State LA. So that means 1 out of every 10 kids at Cal State LA is coming from a low-income family and ending up doing quite well, right? So this is, again, this joint probability. So this is not saying for a given child, your outcomes look the best at Cal State LA. It's saying Cal State LA has relatively good outcomes and lots of low-income kids, which is why there's a lot of mobility happening at Cal State LA at some level, right? And so you can see all of those, the colleges that have the highest mobility rate have that kind of mid-tier public school sort of flavor to them, more or less. If you look at Harvard, there's a mobility rate of 1.8%. So why does Harvard rank relatively low like other Ivy Plus colleges on this list? It's just very simple logic that if you have relatively few low-income kids, obviously you can't have a lot of mobility defined in this way, because you're just working with a small pool of kids to begin with. So even if you have the best outcomes, you're multiplying that by a relatively small number. You know, so more broadly, there are these really sharp differences in mobility rates across colleges. And I think the interesting agenda is to do two things. Figure out, if you want to increase mobility through the higher education system, you want to figure out perhaps how you increase the representation of low-income kids at colleges that have the best outcomes, so increase access at places like Harvard, for instance, or, you know, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, et cetera. And then second, coming back to this chart here, you have a set of colleges that are near the bottom here, where you have quite a few low-income students to work with, but you don't have very high mobility rates because the outcomes just don't look that great at present. And so a second different problem to try to tackle is how do you improve the outcomes in colleges where you don't see very good outcomes at the moment. And typically, you know, that's on margins like trying to get kids not to drop out or, you know, do better in the college and so forth. And that, I think, is also a very challenging and interesting problem. And so what we're going to do what I'm going to do now is, since we're essentially up on time, I'm going to leave the causal effects of colleges to a subsequent lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to have a guest lecture by Tim Rennick from Georgia State, who's been doing a lot of great work, predictive analytics work on trying to improve outcomes there. And then we'll come back to the causal effects of colleges. So that's it for today.